Hey, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Epidemics of Injustice, where this semester's theme is co-disruption for collective liberation in public health. Please introduce yourself in the chat. Please ensure that you complete the check-in form, which is here, the bit.ly link, or you can scan the QR code. During the presentation, please put questions or comments in the chat, and there'll be time for questions at the end. We are trying something a little different today, where we will have one or two, we only have time for one or two participants to mute themselves and share in the chat. Share vocally. They will be able to ask their question of the speakers themselves. Here are the Zoom participant controls. We have the mute button, obviously the start video button if you'd like to share your video, it is not required, or the chat button to open the chat. Please ensure that you've introduced yourselves, and those prompts will be continuously put in by Nandini and Katie. We are the instruction team, Katie O'Neill, Nandini Sarap, and me, Rashika Torres. About the course, this annual course is free and open to the public, and it prepares public health leaders and community members with the tools to bring about social change and address structural determinants of health. All course meetings will take place virtually, and this course is open to students and the public from 5:30 to 6:30 CST. Students taking the course for credit will stay from 6:30 to 7:30 for a closed discussion. Epidemics of Injustice is sponsored by the Collaboratory for Health Justice at the UIC School of Public Health. And we would also like to thank Radical Public Health for the creation, support, and promotion of this program. RPH is celebrating its 11th year. And for more information about RPH, please visit facebook.com/Radical Public Health. Content warning, today's lecture contains material that might be difficult to discuss. Please step away if you need to take care of yourself during the presentation. The Collaboratory for Health Justice acknowledges that the University of Illinois Chicago resides on the traditional territories of the three Fire peoples, the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi, purchased after 2.5 years of open warfare and decades of violent encroachment and the defeat of a pan-Indian movement to keep settlers out of the Great Lakes region at the Treaty of Chicago in 1821, receiving their final payment before moving westward in 1835. The area was also a site of trade, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other Native tribes. The state of Illinois is currently home to more than 75,000 tribal members, and the Chicagoland area is currently home to one of the largest and most diverse urban Native communities in the U.S. Illinois is also the territory of the Ho-Chunk, Miami, Anoka, Menominee, Sac, Fox, and their descendants. By making a land acknowledgement, we recognize that Indigenous peoples are the traditional stewards of the land that we now occupy, living here long before Chicago was a city and still thriving here today. As we work, live, and play on these territories, we must ask what we can do to right the historic wrongs of colonialization and state violence, and support Indigenous community struggles for self-determination and sovereignty. Show up on time and come prepared. Please let everyone participate, listen with an open mind, have mutual respect and appreciation for one another, and respect the privacy and personal information shared during class. This week's talk, week 10, is on universal basic income and income equality, and we have Claire Mackevicius, Phoebe Lin, Jeffrey Isaac Thomas, and Sheridan Fuller. So Claire, who uses she, her pronouns, thinks about how power and policy influence hidden sources of funds, especially in educational spaces, and how this entrenches socially constructed hierarchies. In dissertation projects, she studies private money at public K-12 schools, including parent-teacher organization and friends of groups, and how that can reinforce economic and racial hierarchies. She has ongoing collaborations also focused on consequential distribution decisions, from school boards allocating public resources to large foundations granting private dollars, to an evaluation of Evanston's Guaranteed Income Pilot Program. Through these projects, Claire aims to uncover how unofficial and often unseen resources reinforce particular agendas and entrench inequities. She also works to surface serious possibilities and pathways towards challenging those inequities. She is proud to be one of the 6-person organizing team for the Quant for What, collective planting and nourishing seeds as we dream and build quantitative paradigms for anti-racist transformation, bringing power, awareness, and a humanizing approach to the burgeoning critical quantitative education subfield. Oh, Phoebe, who uses she, they pronouns, thinks about intersectionality and policy feedback. In particular, how policies construct target population and how these constructs unevenly shape distributions of benefits and burdens according to race, gender, sexuality, and class hierarchies, which in turn shape political engagement and collective action. As a child of immigrants from Taiwan, she's passionate about the policy experiences of immigrant and migrant women of color and the ways they engage politically. They hope their work can help build just, inclusive, and caring communities and move towards systems structured around relationality and care rather than extraction. Jeff, who uses he, him pronouns, thinks about poverty and its downstream effects on both a micro and societal level. He is interested in how policy decisions impact poverty and is passionate about solutions that both reduce poverty and provide agency to those most marginalized. He believes equitable economic rights are as vital as civil rights, and that without them, we subject our own citizens to dehumanization and exploitation. He believes guaranteed income can be a tool to address existing economic inequalities and is proud to be involved in the growing number of pilot programs nationwide. Additionally, Jeff is passionate about community building. He's part of Leadership Evanston, a program centered around civic engagement and coaches youth basketball. Sheridan, who uses he, him pronouns, research addresses societal infrastructure's potential to promote families' well-being while acknowledging its pitfalls. He studies children's and families' interactions with income support programs, focusing on the effort of these programs on children's long-term outcomes. Sheridan's prior work as a presidential management fellow at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, informs his research agenda and goal of troubling the narrow foci of income support programs, specifically cash assistance programs, only impacting individuals' employment and earnings, thus building on literature expands our understanding of these programs' effectiveness while also addressing an important driver of inequity and the consequences of historical and racially linked income policies. Let me stop the share. So I am extremely excited to learn about more about this particular program and what is happening with it. So I will take it away and give it to you.
Great, thank you so much. I will go ahead and share my screen. Give me a sec. All right, can everyone see that? Good.
Yeah, it looks good, Jeff. And if you want to, yeah, that I'll let you know when it's.
Yep.
Perfect.
Okay. Cool. Thank you for that introduction. That was great. We're really excited to talk to you all about guaranteed income, about universal basic income, what the differences are, and then also more broadly, some of its history, today's context, how it relates to health outcomes and racial inequities. So we're really excited to talk to you. I will dive right in. So I'm sure many of us are aware guaranteed income programs have really kind of thrust into the spotlight in recent years. I'm sure a handful of people probably first heard about it when Andrew Yang mentioned it. That kind of put it, at least the words became relevant to people. But even before that, programs were getting set in place. And so, just kind of highlighting a spattering of different programs that are popping up. And I made sure to put a few headlines that spotlights Evanston's program as well in there. So real briefly, I'll just kind of talk just how far back it goes. The ideas of guaranteed income or universal basic income are not new. It was talked about as far back as the 1700s with Thomas Paine. Granted, it looked a lot different then. It was more land-based at that point. But they understood that in order to have a functioning society, you needed to, distribute wealth in a way that made sense, in a way that everyone could have a piece of the pie. And one of the things I liked about, well, I guess, I don't know if I liked it necessarily, but I kind of found a through line there with Thomas Paine was, he mentioned that poverty, he said that poverty is not a natural state of life. He called it man-made. And I think there's kind of little bit of a through line there with, what I see now is poverty is largely a policy choice, or at least there's evidence that shows that. So yeah, it goes back very far. Fast forwarding a bit to the 60s and 70s, it became much more in the mindset in the US. This quote here, though it's often credited as most championed by automation fears and well-known conservative men as Richard Nixon and Milton Friedman, guaranteed income's strongest advocates originate in racial justice movements. In reality, guaranteed income has been among the listed demands to achieve racial and economic liberation for people and groups such as Dr. Martin Luther King, the Black Panther Party, and Johnny Tillman of the National Welfare Rights Organization. And I just want to quickly highlight, so obviously I think most people know Martin Luther King was a champion of this cause. He first mentioned guaranteed income in his 1967 book, Where Do We Go From Here? And I believe he mentioned it in his final speech. And one of the things, he kind of raised it in the context of the fact that at the time we were spending all this money on the Vietnam War, which he viewed as an unjust war and largely a waste of our resources. And, and I think kind of fast forwarding today, there's still commonalities with what we're spending our money on and if we're actually investing in our own people. So I thought that was worth highlighting. And Johnny Tillman, so the work she did, frankly, she has one of the most powerful op-eds I've read, talking about, it was called Welfare as a Women's Issue. And at the time, she was helping inform some of Martin Luther King's, teachings. And one of the things that she did is that she really kind of was early in highlighting the fact that, care work, housework, stuff that at the time was just considered women's work was not compensated for. And it was largely just not, it was not viewed as anything that deserved any sort of financial compensation for it. And so she really highlighted the fact, and this was also during the time of, the perpetuating of the welfare queen myth, stuff like that. And so she really, really highlighted the fact that, the fact that it wasn't dehumanizing to be on welfare. And she kind of became, a really vocal leader in that case. So real quick, I'm just going to kind of go through the difference between universal basic income and guaranteed income. They're often interchangeably used, but they are technically different. The universal basic income is exactly what it sounds like. It's universal, so everyone would get it regardless of financial status or any background. Whereas guaranteed income is more targeted. It's to those that, it depends on the program, obviously, but it's much more targeted. It doesn't go to everyone. And the whole idea is to try to lift up, to help those that need it the most. So I did kind of also forget that on the last slide, it mentioned Richard Nixon. And I just want to point out that one of the things that we're going to talk about is how the work in this field is largely narrative driven. To build the groundswell of support, it can kind of work both ways. And what happened with Nixon and during that time was they did have some negative income tax experiments. And, predictably with the political landscape as it was back then, they took things like a slight reduction for younger people in working as, definitive proof that this will disincentivize people from working. That wasn't true. As it turned out, there was whatever reduction in work for that younger cohort was offset by an increase in completing high school. Another thing that they went crazy about was they thought it would cause the divorce rate to go up. They thought it would just dissolve families. Well, it turns out there was that coincided with cases of domestic violence. So at the time they were like, this will kill the nuclear family. But look, with reanalysis, we can kind of look back and see probably gave agency to people who needed it and who could get out of bad situations. So yeah, and we're going to talk more about that narrative driven work, but I just want to kind of point that out there. So fast forward to 1982, and we have our first kind of real case of a universal basic income in our country. And this is the Permanent Dividend Fund of Alaska, funded by oil revenues, and it goes to every resident. And it's something that is widely popular there. Everyone there seems to like it. They vote like in large numbers for it. And I also want to point out that Alaska, it's probably not a coincidence, they have one of the lowest wealth equality gaps in the nation. They're typically in the bottom 3 to 5. Yeah. Fast forwarding even further, I want to mention the Economic Security Project. So this was founded in 2016, and they've become a very, very important figure in a lot of the pilots that are popping up. They were instrumental in the Stockton, California pilot, which has largely become like a blueprint for a lot of other pilots. They have a lot of powerful voices in that group and a lot of money behind it. So it was one of the co-founders was Chris Hughes, who I believe was a co-founder of Facebook, or at least a high person in Facebook at the time till about 2007. I also want to give them a shout out that guaranteed income community of practice. That's something that I'm part of now. And it's a great resource for those that are interested in learning more about advocacy. And they have all sorts of workshops. So they have workshops on how to message, how to reach out to grassroots programs, how to reach out to nonprofits. So it's an invaluable tool, and frankly, I think it's a big reason why there's been momentum for guaranteed income in general. So going kind of chronologically, so this program is called Magnolia Mothers Trust, which was in 2018. But I will briefly mention there was actually one in 2015. It was actually championed by Dolly Parton. It was in Tennessee. They had wildfires that ravaged Tennessee, and she actually just out of her own foundation funded, I forgot, for basically anyone that was impacted by it. They had monthly checks going out for about 6 to 8 months. There wasn't any research involved. Obviously, that was like, there was wildfires and she did that. But just want to point out, for accuracy's sake, that there was something. But yeah, so 2018 was when Magnolia Mothers Trust was formed, and this is the longest running GI program to date. It's what's unique about this program is it's specifically for Black mothers in Jackson, Mississippi, and the results have been fantastic. I mean, the people who have got it, they've self-reported, all sorts of great benefits, but I just put in a few there. Ability to pay off bills. Collectively, they paid off $10,000 in predatory debt. The one thing worth mentioning is that, it wasn't technically, there wasn't a control group in this case. So a little different from some of the other pilots that would pop up. Yeah, and then that brings us to the Stockton Economic Empowerment Demonstration, aka SEED. And this is kind of what really lit the fire for other programs to follow suit. So I mentioned that Economic Security Project. They helped put this together, and this one was a highly publicized RCT. And I mentioned some of the key findings here. I think it might be mentioned a little later in this presentation as well. But what was, I think, unique about this demonstration is that they were very intentional about its design being public. They released spending data really early, and then they had a storytelling cohort as well. So individuals that volunteered to kind of tell their story really kind of showed what the impact was, and it was pretty clear what the impact was. There was so many, the anxiety went down, financial scarcity went down. They had more time. People were able to take a breath, and then a lot of the narratives of before, like disincentivizing work, were largely dispelled with, at least with this demonstration. There was an increase in full-time employment by the end, and people were able to find employment that was more meaningful to them. So this was really, like I said, the most kind of an inflection point in terms of other pilot programs. And Mayor Tubbs, obviously, you got an HBO documentary. He ended up being a kind of, he spearheaded this MGI, Mayors for a Guaranteed Income, which has been a big reason why there's a lot more pilot programs today. There's about 100 going on now, and I think roughly about half of them are from related to or associated with Mayors for a Guaranteed Income. And there's programs popping up around the world as well. And one thing that's really neat about all these programs, and what I like about the fact that there is guaranteed income, is that these communities know their own constituents best, and so they're able to make these pilot programs to address what's important to them. So it goes to different people based on the locale. So there was one in San Francisco that was geared towards trans folks. There's one in New Orleans that was geared towards troubled youth. There was one in multiple sites. What was called, I think it was called Baby's First Years, where it was going to mothers that just had babies, and that one was really kind of cool because they were able to find some data in terms of health outcomes. They found that recipients that got that money in that program, they had the babies that were just born had increased brain activity versus those in the control group. So just kind of showing how there's pretty obvious health outcomes even at ages that young. And I'll just briefly mention the programs around the world. Canada, they also had one, dating back around the time when the US had those negative tax income experiments in the 70s. Canada had one as well, and their findings found that they had less hospitalizations. They also had that younger cohort kind of have a slight reduction in work, but then a much higher increase of high school completion rates. So people were able to prioritize what was important to them. And so this kind of brings me to kind of the advocacy work and where we are today. So the Economic Security Project, they threw this huge conference last year, which was a collection of mayors for guaranteed income, local leaders, community members, advocacy members. It was really neat. I attended the conference, and keynote speaker was Dr. Bernice King. And it was so powerful to hear her speak. And one of the things that she kind of was mentioning is that this is something that you have to realize that it's going to be an ongoing battle. It's going to take a long time for this to go beyond the pilot level and to go into a federal level or into an actual codified level. But just hearing her speak and kind of mentioning what this meant to Martin Luther King was just so powerful. And then I also put in a picture in the bottom of those were 4 individuals that were recipients of guaranteed income in different programs, and kind of just seeing how it impacted their lives, I think was so important. And I think a very important thing moving forward in terms of the advocacy work and what it means to show how it how humanizing it is to be able to breathe and to make like the impacts that it has on people. I think a lot of times when these programs are discussed, it's discussed by people that are so far removed from it. And kind of hearing these people's stories, it was just, I don't know, it was moving, but you could also see how it varies from person to person. Vernell, he was part of the Youth Force New Orleans. He was so funny, but he also had a quote that I loved. It was, how could I learn about learning how to use money until I had money? And I love that quote. But yeah, I think that conference was kind of for me an inflection point of kind of seeing the progress that's been made, and realizing the fact that these aren't just one-off pilots, that this is actually a broader movement. So with that, I'll just do a quick check-in. Just like a kind of like a trivia question, I guess. So what percentage of those in the US do you think are able to pay in full using cash or its equivalent if a $400 emergency expense comes up? You could throw it in the chat. And let me just see, I'll pull up the chat. Actually, I can't see the chat, so I'm just going to go ahead and go to the next slide. So per the Federal Reserve, that figure is 68%. But obviously that number is much lower for those that are in these programs. So typically when we've seen it, when we've seen that figure, it's been closer to 50% or less. But yeah, with that, I'm going to kick it over to Sheridan if you want to take over.
Thanks, Jeff. And I'll just let you know when to progress the slide. So Jeff did a great job of laying out kind of the landscape of guaranteed income programs, and it's linked to universal basic income. But one thing we kind of wanted to, pull out a little bit is guaranteed income is basically just a form of cash assistance provided to, households who are, in great need of critical resources, and to ensure all families have access to a kind of a baseline level of resources. But then also thinking that GI is connected to, existing programs that kind of provide those type of services and supports, and also proposed programs that provide that level of assistance. And so what we wanted to do, we felt it was important to then contextualize, given that, GI is a variant of a cash assistance program, what's the historical relationship of cash between the United States and cash relationships programs, like who's been able to access it, who hasn't been able to access it, who's been included, who hasn't. What is the current landscape of those programs? And then what does the future look like? And we felt it's important to provide this kind of contextualization because it helps provide context for one, there's a lot of discussions and debates about how does GI need to look like? Does it need to be a new program? Can it be incorporated into existing programs? But then also so we can be thinking about what have been the pitfalls and the shortcomings of past attempts to kind of provide, cash assistance to families. And so how can we make sure we don't make those same kind of mistakes in the future, but then also understand how GI programs might be trying to play a more corrective role of past injustices as well. So it's important to understand that full context, to understand, okay, what ideas should we be pursuing and how can we kind of make them with an informed historical context? You can slide forward, Jay. So not too dissimilar to local jurisdictions experimenting with cash assistance or with GI programs now, states began piloting their own cash assistance programs around the turn of the 1900s, between 1911 and 1930s. And these programs were known as Mother's Pension Programs, and they provided monthly assistance to single-parent families. As the name of the program suggested, these were mostly single-parent households led by women. And interesting enough, Illinois actually had the first Mother's Pension Program. And so Illinois is the first one to adopt it, and slowly it begins to diffuse across the Midwest and northern states, and eventually to the West and South. But then you have the Great Depression hit. So the Great Depression begins to impose a lot of pressure on state budgets, which does two things. It increases the population of people who are eligible applicants, at the same time that states are having kind of declining revenues to be able to finance these programs. And so state officials and local officials began looking to the federal government to step in and help support the sustainability of the program. And so what you see is the Aid to Families with Dependent Children program enacted as part of the suite of New Deal programs ushered in with the Roosevelt administration, and specifically enacted as part of the Social Security Act of 1935. And so it establishes a national program in an effort to respond to the concerns from state lawmakers. Now, AFDC is similar to Mother's Pension Programs in that it provides monthly assistance to single-parent households, but households here were eligible when their children were deprived of parental support due to death, continued absence, or an incapacity of a parent. So again, largely single-parent households led by mothers, although not exclusively. There are situations of single-parent fathers as well. But a key distinction is that the program would now be a federal-state partnership. And so the federal government would kick in approximately half of the resources needed to fund the payments, while the states would oversee and administer the day-to-day operations of the program. And now historians and political development scholars argue that this kind of split control of funding and localized administration was a function of racial politics and legislative strategy. During this time period, the 1930s, Southern Democratic lawmakers were a central component of the Congress and the Democratic caucus. And so the argument is that they sought to receive the benefit of federal money without the egalitarian rules, policies, and practices that often came with federal dollars. And so the literature suggests that this localized administration allows states to enact rules and regulations that generate disparities in program access and benefit levels to cash assistance. And this is kind of best exemplified by some states, for example, Georgia, which attempted to enact quotas on the number of Black families that could access cash assistance through the AFDC program. Now, this is 1935 that's taking place, where you have this national program, but states' experience with mother pensions programs foreshadowed the relevance of local discretion and program access. So mother's pensions are in place between the 1910s and 1930s, and during this era, only 3% of all recipients receiving assistance through the program were Black. So it's important to compare this 3% to the broader demographic population of Black families during this time period, around 10 to 12%. And then also to the overrepresentation of Black households, as an example, amongst the total number of households that are experiencing poverty and would potentially be eligible to meet the income criteria for this program. Jeff, you can go to the next slide. And so here, so you can think, okay, why, so what is this, how do we think of this 3%? Why does this kind of foreshadow disparities in cash assistance? Well, one is three criteria. The first one is kind of the timing of states' adoption. And so you can see in this kind of the map that's at the bottom of the slide here, darker shaded states are states that adopted it early, and lighter shaded states are ones that adopted it later. This is from Theda Skocpol's Protecting Mothers and Soldiers book. And what we see is, if you think about where Black households, as an example, lived during this time period, it's still predominantly in the South. And so one way you have this disparity emerge is that Southern states are the last ones to adopt these type of cash assistance programs. The second is you have discretion and implementation. So today you might think of a state adopting a policy or a new program, it's created, and everyone in the state can kind of begin to apply and have access. But with mother's pensions, the rules were set up in a way where a state said, you local jurisdiction may set up a mother's pension program. And it's not a requirement to enact. And so what you often saw in a lot of cases is that jurisdictions, particularly in the South, even after they passed these policies, jurisdictions where there are large numbers of Black households or Black families, they forego taking up or adopting or enacting mother's pension programs. There's a concern, they are not interested in having public resources being made available to low-income families of color. And then there's also this kind of racial politics with the economy, particularly in the South, where there's a concern that when the Black households, or for example, get access to these resources, they won't be working on the farms or doing sharecropping work. And then lastly, is this kind of de facto and de jure exclusion. So you have de facto in the sense that the political leaders at this time at the local level who are making these decisions are still largely white, given the way the electoral structure is set up in the United States at this time. And then you also have kind of just explicit, even in cases where local jurisdictions adopt these policies, they make explicit rules that, Black households or only white households are able to access these programs. And so here, this historical context is kind of important, and it may feel outdated, but it's important because AFDC, our national program of cash assistance, is modeled on a mother's pension program, not just in how it provides monthly assistance, but also how it carried forward opportunities for local rules to moderate access to critical resources for individuals, for children, and families experiencing vulnerability. And then it's particularly important because this history is sticky. So as an example, the generosity of mother's pension programs in the early 1900s are strongly predictive of the level and generosity of AFDC benefits 50 years later, and are still predictive of the benefit levels of cash assistance provided in the current iteration of the program, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, today. Jeff, you can go to the next slide. Jeff kind of touched on this. So at the same time that we have all of this this action happening at the local level that kind of impacts who could access cash assistance, there's a lot of research being done that is happening alongside this, that's focusing on the cost of these programs, and costs being defined as more families accessing the program and potentially lower employment rates. And policymakers are also beginning to enact reforms aimed at reducing the cost and promoting work. And so the research begins to focus on using this kind of framework to evaluate these programs, looking at what's the effective work requirements on time limits, on job trainings, et cetera, and less attention on what's the impact of the assistance itself. And so, yes, while you do see some literature that this welfare reform type literature that identifies potential short-term declines in employment which are associated with cash assistance, the long-term results often are inconclusive. It's difficult to disentangle. They're inconclusive, and they're inconclusive because it's difficult to disentangle from broader economic trends and other co-occurring policy changes. And then in addition to all of that, there's less attention given to the program's impact on children's well-being, which is ironic given that the impetus for creating mothers' pensions and AFDC was about children's well-being. It's in the name of the program, aid to dependent children, aid to families with dependent children. Jeff, you can go to the next slide. Today, we have a broader suite of programs that are providing cash assistance. One is a temporary assistance for needy families, which was the successor to AFDC. In this iteration, access to cash assistance through this program has kind of been constrained over time due to changes that were enacted with welfare reform. So as an example, 68% of families received cash assistance under AFDC in 1996, but under TANF, only 25 out of 100 families are able to access those resources. But at the same time, we had this kind of contraction in cash assistance through the successor to AFDC. We have these other programs like the Earned Income Tax Credit, the Child Tax Credit, that are kind of filling the gap. And food stamps, even though that's not an explicitly cash assistance program, it's treated like cash, like amongst families that are helping to kind of fill the gap and provide critical resources to millions of families. Jeff, you can go to the next slide. So at the same time that we see this change in the landscape of providing cash assistance, researchers have also shifted from having such a narrow focus on the cost of these programs and now giving a lot of attention to the benefits, looking at the impacts of food stamps, Medicaid, and the Earned Income Tax Credit, the Child Tax Credit, and I throw in Medicaid as well, just because it's part of the landscape of income support programs. And across all these programs, you find that there's improved physical health in the short run and long run for children, improved mental health for parents, greater educational attainment and performance amongst children in these households. And for children who are in households that participate in these programs, you see higher earnings and likelihood to work when they're adults. Jeff, you can go to the next slide. And so this kind of leads us, okay, we've talked about what's the history, a little bit of the current landscape of programs. Next thing is, what's the future look like? How does a guaranteed income program or a universal basic income, what does that look like moving forward? Now, we've had experiments with the pandemic with the expanded child tax credit, which effectively provided a universal child allowance, which is a kind of an iteration of guaranteed income. A lot of jurisdictions are using money provided through the pandemic to states and localities to test out their own guaranteed income programs. And while Congress did not decide to kind of continue the expanded child tax credit, you now see lawmakers proposing kind of iterations, small tweaks to the child tax credit that was adopted during 2021, see if that can garner political attention. And so there's kind of a little bit of uncertainty or a dynamic period here, but there's been some setbacks in trying to move GI policies forward, but it also creates some opportunities to do these tests, like experiments that Evanston is doing, and opportunities to think about it both at a local level, at a state level, and a national level, and how these RCTs might be playing a role.
All right. Thanks so much, Sheridan, for that very important history on cash assistance. And I just wanted here to highlight sort of that welfare programs and our welfare system are embedded in these larger structures that are not only racialized, which Sheridan really pointed out, and one of your pre-reads pointed out that I think resonated with folks, but are also gendered. And so Evelyn Nakano-Glenn has a book on equal freedom, which I highly recommend. And she talks about both citizenship and labor being structured by race and gender. And so citizenship has been used to draw boundaries between those who are included as members of the community and entitled to respect, protection, and rights, and those who are excluded and thus not entitled to recognition and rights. Labor places people in the economic order, affecting access to goods and services, level autonomy, standard of living, and quality of life. Both have been constituted in ways that privilege white men and give them power over racialized minorities and women. And of course, this is something that is not only true in the past, as sort of Jeff highlighted with Johnny Tillman's work, but is an example of something in the present. Jeff, sorry, you can go to the next slide. I just wanted to highlight some of the work folks are doing around domestic labor and domestic work. Most domestic workers in the US are women, over 90%. They're disproportionately women of color, and they're more likely than other workers to be born outside the US. They're 3 times more likely to be living in poverty when they're paid, if at all, are earning below minimum wage, and few receive labor protections and benefits and rights. In fact, there is no national level of coverage of labor protections for these women. So, as an example, how this structuring in labor by race and gender, and not only that by ethnicity and citizenship, are continuing to the present. And if you're interested, there is a petition to sort of support a current bill to sort of cover basic labor protections like paid time off and et cetera for these workers. Jeff, you can go to the next slide. Okay, and so we've talked a bit about, the importance of economic security, and I just wanted to highlight how that there are sort of these long-term and downstream effects of economic security, and thinking more broadly, there are, of course, the health benefits. There are also these effects on agency and social, political, and economic engagement. And so the Stockton evaluation highlights the potential for, increasing opportunities for agency like self-determination, and also these health benefits of reductions in symptoms of depression, anxiety. And Jeff, you can go to the next slide. And in sum, really just highlighting that guaranteed income can be thought of more expansively as not just producing economic security, but as a way to build sort of more vibrant and inclusive democracy. And I'll hand it off to Claire.
Sure. So with that sort of really broad reach historical context, and thinking back on what all has happened, over the course of many, many decades, and thinking sort of very broadly forward, I'm now going to zoom us right into what all is up in Evanston, which is a small city of nearly 80,000 folks. It borders the north border of the city of Chicago. And just to give a sense, on this slide, there are 2 maps side by side. One on the left is showing a modern day life expectancy across census tracts, with darker shaded colors are shorter life expectancies. And this is just really highlighting, and there's the Chicago version. Really, any city in the US is going to have the modern day version of vestiges of, in this particular case, racist home loan programs back from a redlining map in the 1930s, maps onto life expectancy really clearly and directly here. So Evanston, it's a small city. In some ways, it is a racial and ethnically diverse city, socioeconomically as well. And that's the site for what all we're evaluating, which is a guaranteed income pilot program there. So Jeff, if you hop forward next. And the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, really, of course, starting almost exactly 3 years ago, or really shutting things down in a big way universally, right around then, blossomed into a lot of different resources afforded, everything from federal COVID relief funds, state funds. Here's the city of Evanston site that this is, today's version of really a broad swath of resources that were afforded and sort of freed up, newly focused on providing relief for folks, which is everyone really affected by the pandemic. And in particular, there are some populations that were particularly hard to reach with some of those relief funds and efforts. And we focus on in the evaluation of sort of this pilot in Evanston on youth, undocumented folks, and elderly folks. And I'll get into that just in a couple slides. But Jeff, if you go on, in particular, as I mentioned, there are government resources freed up. The city of Evanston, very much part of that. They coordinated with a local nonprofit, the Evanston Community Foundation, and Northwestern University, which is a university, private university based in Evanston. And these are sort of these 3 institutions that joined together as funding sources, especially to target some of those really hard to reach populations with a guaranteed income pilot. So Jeff, if you hop to the next slide. Here you'll see side by side an English and a Spanish version of the flyers that came out towards the end of last summer, early fall, inviting folks to apply to this guaranteed income program. And this is the kind of thing you'd see in sort of all of those pilots that Jeff and Sheridan kind of touched on that are really popping up in localities across the country. And if you hop to the next slide, Jeff. In particular, as I mentioned, the Evanston program is focused on Evanston community members. It's targeted to the extent that it's focused on folks who are at or below 250% of the household federal poverty line. And then those three really hard to reach populations, especially hard hit by the pandemic, including folks who were 18 to 24-year-olds, elderly folks, and undocumented community members. So if you hop to the next slide, Jeff. So I'm just going to give a very brief, sense of kind of the research evaluation. What all do we bring to the pilot program, which is just running as a program, right, out of the city of Evanston? And we come in and we're thinking about, first of all, understanding impacts and implementation sort of broadly. There's a side benefit in the state of Illinois. There's a good law that protects prior means tested benefits for extra income supports that are coming through research evaluated programs. And to be clear about sort of our orientation and situation as researchers, all of us are bringing ourselves, the hands that we hold, our lens that we turn towards the sort of focus of our evaluation. And to draw on our third reading for today, about sort of the effects of sort of narrative work in pushing policies forward, we're clear that data alone doesn't move people to act or shift their thinking. So Jeff, if you hop forward. And you can click ahead. Our research evaluation is really rooted in two broad threads. Folks who are coming from the policy evaluation world might be familiar with that randomized controlled trial, or RCT, sort of individual level sense of the effects of a program. We are running one of those. More folks applied than the 150 slots that were available. So we're comparing the outcomes for those folks who are in the program. The first checks went out in December of last year, and folks get $500 a month for the 12 months following December. We're interviewing people who are a part of it. And then we also have the second thread where we're focusing on, or we're calling it sort of pilot to policy. And we're thinking about delving both into records, and we're speaking with those stakeholders, certainly including Northwestern Evanston Community Foundation and City of Evanston, community members as well, to get a sense of sort of the pathway from a finite 150 person, 1 year long pilot program, and what sorts of avenues forward really contribute to instantiating something as a long running funded program. If you can go ahead, Jeff, to the next piece. And with that, I will sort of close the sort of very brief research evaluation touch point. And, I'm eager to get into questions with folks. And thinking about the way that, we're sort of orienting, and this is, all the way back nearly 30 years ago, a Meadows quote, and that vision is the most vital step in the policy process. If we don't know where we want to go, it makes little difference that we make great progress. Yet vision is not only missing almost entirely from policy discussions, it's missing from our whole culture. We talk about our fears, frustrations, and doubts endlessly, but we talk only rarely and with embarrassment about our dreams. And we find ourselves, with really well-exercised sort of retrospective critique muscles that we're really, really hone those in grad school spaces, or even in organizing spaces, kind of like what's gone wrong. And we invite you all to sort of dream and vision with us of what's possible. And Jeff, if you go to the next slide. And then more recently, this is out of a Ruha Benjamin piece, charging us to imagine and craft the worlds you cannot live without, just as you dismantle the ones we cannot live within. So I'll invite you folks with the remaining time to please do go ahead and put questions in the chat, and then I'll let Phoebe bring us on home, and then we'll get into discussion.
Great. So Jeff, you can just go forward, because I do want to be mindful of the time, make sure we have enough time for questions, but maybe we can, because that quote is so inspiring from Ruha Benjamin, just take like 30 seconds, put like a word or a phrase in the chat of just when you're thinking about crafting future worlds, what values and commitments do you wish to center? Because I kind of want us to hold that in our mind space. So we can just have that going on in the chat, and then we can, look at that later on when we open up for questions. So next slide, Jeff. I'm trying to see what I should cover. I mean, Jeff talked about this earlier in terms of the power of narrative work. And so, and as Claire highlighted too, like the research and the data is not enough. And so who are our current narratives building power for? Who do they leave behind? I think that's a really important question to consider. And as you're thinking of, I'm seeing like community and compassion come up in the chat and liberation, like what are the narratives we can craft around that? And how is deservingness being constructed in those narratives? Are just kind of like guiding posts that we can use as we think about like with our North Star, like what are values we're shooting for. And then Jeff, if you can go to the next slide, and then one more. Okay, super brief. I think this is the thing that I'll end on just because of time, but a lot of times there is like the myth of, well, when you institute a large policy like this, like how is it going to get funded, and it's going to cost all this money, and like you have to give up something else, and wanting to shift away from that myth and instead have us think about policies as layered, including funding. And so thinking about the funding of a particular policy as an opportunity to work towards some of our collective visions and goals. And so instead of thinking about and what policies can be implemented alongside, you know, a UBI or GI type thing to achieve the vision we want. And then Jeff, if you just go to the next slide and just leave this up, but I won't cover this, but these are ideas of like thinking about funding as policies. And so what is a constellation of policies that we can have in addition to UBI and GI to support this vision? And I love everything I'm seeing in the chat, like dignity and yes. So yeah, we're gonna close there and then I guess open up for questions. Feel free to put it in the chat, or I think there was maybe some students who were going to vocalize some questions as well.